First on BBC One.
Turn my camera off. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 37, I think it is, I forgot to check, of the History CV of Britain. This evening, I've got with me Richard Johnson of the Orgulug YouTube channel, and we're going to be discussing all sorts of things to do with King Arthur. We're going to be looking at some reviews of author's work on the subject, and we're going to look at ways of approaching Arthurian history. So it's quite a divided subject. Talking of which, digital ID, anyone? Oops. Let's move on very quickly. Right, okay. So where am I? Right, okay. So I'm going to mention Adrian Gilbert's new video. It's the first part of a series of videos on the mysteries of the Fleur de Lis, or the Flower of Life. It encompasses so much history, the 100 Years' War, the original French flag, and then you move over to the tricolor flag of France. There's the grisly death of Edward, I think it was the second or third, all sorts of fascinating history. So if you haven't seen it already, please do go over after this to the Adrian Gilbert 1 YouTube channel and check it out. Okay, right, I'm going to show a comment that I received today on my post, or was it yesterday, one of the two, on the post for this evening's show on YouTube. So I'll just show you this. There is a reason why I want to show you this comment. So I'm just going to share screen very quickly, and hopefully now you can see that on screen. And I'll just scroll down. I had a comment from somebody who's appeared on the CV before, Monica Escobar. Now Monica is an ardent fan of Wilson and Blackett's work on King Arthur, and she commented on my post, "Hi there. Critique against Alan Wilson might not be helpful when we want to convince a wider audience about Britain's hidden history. Alan walked on the right path because he showed no mercy to academia, the Vatican, and the Crown, those who are guilty for hiding the true British Welsh king line. Reading Alan's books is a gem for the mind and heart. It's simple to understand. Know your enemy. Understand what went wrong in his story. I'm wishing Richard a great show." Moni. Okay, so I replied, "Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, Moni. I completely understand your point of view. The History CV of Britain is still in its infancy, and so am I in terms of understanding the truth about our history. With that in mind, I'm trying to attract guests with different takes on it all, so I can eventually compose a CV that represents a true representation of our past. I'm not interested in taking sides. I just want to discover the truth." And I got a thanks, Paul, from Moni. So I enjoyed that interaction, and it's very important that we all try and get on. There we are. I think I'm back. That's it. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm showing you that Also because when I was in Oxford at the Storytelling Festival, I spent time with my friend Millie Jackdaw, who might be watching. And if you're watching, Millie, hello, how are you? And she asked me, she didn't so much ask me as she suggested that I make more of a point of talking about why I'm doing this. What is the point behind the history CV of Britain? And as I just said to Moni in that comment, I'm trying to collate as much information as possible about British history before, I suppose, trying to work out, what's right, what's wrong, what's true, and what isn't. And that will probably take me an extremely long time. But it's an awful lot of fun doing this. And as I said to Moni, I'm only interested in the truth. I'm not interested in taking sides. I want to establish what we can prove and what we can't prove. But one thing is for certain, a lot of credible British history is being lost or obfuscated by the authorities. And so this is very much a fight back in that sense as well. I hope that all makes sense. I think it made sense. I don't know. Perhaps you'll tell me. Okay, let's have a look in the chat box and see who we've got this evening. So, oh, blimey, there's quite a few people here. So, Hugh Evans is here. Good to see you, Hugh. David J is with us. Marshall Abrahams, as always, is with us. Good to see you, Marshall. Robert Paul Corliss. This is an interesting comment coming up from Adam Groves. I can't believe the Richard Johnson is coming here to be on live. I wonder what he meant by that. Dialerod, good to see you, Dialerod. Is this the right room for trolling? I believe Rich mentioned in a post that there may be an opportunity for a good old-fashioned troll. Okay, it's heating up already, I can see. Lord Tadley is with us this evening. Good to see you, John. Lord Batty. And I'm going to guess and say that must be Matt Apocalypse, who's been on the CV before. Good to see you, Matt. Hope you're well, my friend. There's a new name. Levitation 25 is with us. Okay, and then you're all having a good old chinwag in there. So that's nice to see. Brilliant. Okay. Right. I think it's time. So taking the History CV hot seat this evening is Richard Johnson of the Orgulug YouTube channel. Now, if you haven't gone over to the Orgulug YouTube channel yet and you have an interest in Arthurian history, I highly recommend Richard's channel. It's I really like his pragmatic and rational approach to this history. He doesn't take sides. And he's made some really polished videos with lovely illustrations, great narration throughout. So if you're even just mildly interested in King Arthur, I highly recommend his channel. Okay. And it's also really acted as a great foundation for my own studies and researches as well. I should point that out as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to bring him on now. The man, the legend, Richard Johnson. Welcome to the CV. How you doing?
Thank you for the kind introduction.
That's all right. It's a pleasure, mate. So where should we start this evening with all this, Richard? I know you want to talk about some reviews, don't you?
Well, yeah. So when you interviewed me recently,
Mhm.
we spoke about the historicity of Arthur, whether or not there's a real person at the heart of the stories. And there's different approaches to this, and the conclusions drawn are varied, ranging from skeptical positions that say that Arthur was a legendary or mythological figure that became historicized in literature, but was never a real person as such. And a lot of it boils down to whether the 9th century Historia Brittonum and the Arthurian entries in the Welsh annals, the Annales Cambriae, can be thought of as legit. There are references in early Welsh poetry too, sometimes used as a source of history. That's a bit of a minefield. I'm going to give it a wide berth today because of its obscure nature and no doubt complicated transmission. If you're brave enough to have me back on in the future, I'll have a look at the poetry, okay?
Yeah, you're always welcome, mate.
All right, nice one. But the Historia Britonum, that called Arthur a leader of battles and credited him in winning 12.
This is Nennius, yeah?
Yeah, sometimes attributed to Nennius, sometimes not attributed to him. The attribution is doubted today, but there are versions that say that Nennius was the author. Probably written about 829, but what were the source materials? It's not known and it's debated. And then the Welsh Annals, the Annales Cambriae, gives 2 Arthurian entries. The year 72, which corresponds to 516 AD, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors. And the other one is the year 93, corresponding to 537, where it mentions the strife of Camlan, in which Arthur and Mordred, fell, and there was death in Britain and in Ireland. Now, could these entries be early, and could they corroborate the historical Arthur? One notable but influential skeptic was David Dunville, and his criticism of the Historia Britonum in particular, that's the earliest source that supposedly gives the deeds of Arthur, has really left its mark. He basically called the Arthurian sources inadmissible evidence, as they were so infected with legendary material that they were really useless as a source of history. And the Welsh Annals, then, the Annales Cambriae, the early entries are considered sort of retrospective, so added much later on, sort of questionable historicity. So in answering the question, was Arthur a real person or not, most probably sit on the fence. And we can see why it's like this, to be honest, because of the nature of the source material. But I suppose it's a bit frustrating for the casual reader who, understandably want an answer yes or no. But I suppose the main stumbling block is this perception that there's a lack of surviving records that are clearly from Arthur's own time. Okay, now, despite this, there have been and are some really well-argued positive arguments made in defense of the historical Arthur. And I'll go through some of these.
Okay.
Because when we were speaking off camera before, I know that you're interested in the positive approaches, as am I.
Mm-hmm.
Now, among these positive approaches, in a way at least, is that of the amateur historians, Alan Wilson, Baron Blackett, who you've well covered on the show, and also their later collaborator, Adrian Gilbert, your old China plate. You've well covered these ideas, and I've done a little bit too on my channel. I've given you some views off camera. So basically, on Arthur, they suggested that the real Arthur was a composite of 2 different people that were part of the same lineage focused on southeastern Wales. The more influential to the story was a historical king of Gwent called Athrwys ap Meirug, a theory with a cult following outside of academia, but generally rejected even by the more casual reader. And, you can just have a look at comments on neutral Facebook groups, for instance, that cover King Arthur. I know you were part of some of the groups as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, was Athrwys Arthur? There's no explicit connection in the early sources, in my opinion. But answering this definitively is complicated. It's complicated by the fact that dating Athrwys is difficult because the sources that mention him don't give dates as such. And a critical analysis of these sources by contemporary scholars suggests that Athrois lived later. On the other hand, I suppose that there are sources that associate Arthur with southeast Wales. I stress Arthur. Like the wonders annexed to some versions of the Historia Britonum, Arthur's court being in Caerleon in the Historia Region Britanniae, and Arthur's appearance in the lives of the Welsh saints. It's far from clear that this was also Athrois, and the sources of questionable historicity, to say the least. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're definitely not the same person. And what I'll say is, of the real people suggested as Arthur, Athrois fits better than most. But it's far from clear that they were the same person, and more say that it's definitely not. Okay. So, as I say, Wilson, Blackett, and Gilbert's books have a certain following, but their ideas are largely rejected by the greater part of those who've researched the topic, to the annoyance of their supporters, of course.
I'll just fill in there. Can I just say that I'm not an expert on the works of Wilson and Blackett, so my opinion on them is not really qualified as such. But from what I've read, just to be clear, I've read the first 3 parts of Arturius Rex Discovered. They seem to base a lot of their, for want of a better word, discoveries on the names of places, the names of towns. They seem to kind of, try and find a place based on some information and then say, oh, look, that place fits the bill nicely. So what I'm trying to say basically is it would seem to me that a lot of their work, or at least some of it, was speculative.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And these are the comments that you tend to find in the reviews as well that I'll be going into. Yeah. So, yeah.
Can I just say one more thing about that, Richard? Sorry, then I'll let you carry on.
It's your show, isn't
it? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I would say that I don't have a problem with speculation on, with historical subjects like Arthur or the early Christian church in Britain and all these fascinating subjects, as long as it's, I suppose, not presented as being, fact. It's speculation.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's where they went wrong slightly. They seem to be really kind of adamant that everything they discovered was correct and factual and right. But from reading their information, I would say that some of it was based, at least, on speculation.
Yeah, I mean, and there's speculation based on speculation. So they speculate, and a bit later on, that's taken as fact, and they speculate again on the back of that. And they've been criticized for that. And, yes, basically what you've just said, I know. But, yeah, that was their typical methodology to an extent. Okay, so why were their ideas rejected? Where I'm going with this, because you republished an interview between Richard Hall and Adrian Gilbert.
Yeah.
Was it this week or last week or something like that?
I think it was last week.
Okay. It was recorded a while ago, though, wasn't it? A few years ago now.
Yeah, 2018.
Okay. But the claims, the basic ideas, at least, are widely repeated. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay, so before I go into it, I don't want people to think that I'm saying the interview or the books are a complete write-off. I respect Adrian Gilbert. I've got a lot out of his stuff. And even Wilson and Blackett, I've got stuff from their work as well. So nothing's a complete write-off. But there are also some legitimate objections to some of the ideas that I don't think we got a sense of from the interview.
Okay.
So what are the comments that I'm on about? So I think there was this idea suggested that maybe Wilson and Blackett were being attacked, and this sense that their ideas in history were being resisted by the establishment, and supposedly there was an antagonistic academic establishment that upholds the status quo and resist new ideas for what seem to be self-interested reasons to preserve the academic's credibility, not to get proven wrong, keep receiving government-sponsored grants and that sort of thing. And then they went on to corruption, saying in Wales particularly, there is a huge amount of corruption, that you have a political establishment that's been unchanged pretty much for 100 years. It's been run by the same people. They call them the Tafia or the Tafiosi. You understand what that means, you?
I think it was a term that was created by Alan Wilson originally, wasn't it? That was Wilson's term.
Oh, was it? Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm assuming it's kind of jokey word from Taffy, a derogatory word for a Welsh person, a mafia, the organizer.
Yeah, I'm 99% certain that I've heard Wilson say it before, and a long time before what's gone on recently. So,
all right, so you get the implication anyway.
Yep, I do.
That's what I believe the implication was. And then they said these people, they control who gets the grants, they get backsheesh in their back pocket, and there's even people who are doing things which are wrong, particularly in archaeology. That's fair. Was that the impression?
Could you say the last bit again, please?
Yeah. There's people doing things which are wrong, particularly in archaeology.
I can remember Alan Wilson listening to him once saying that some of these archaeologists would go up to a potential site that was of interest to British history, and when they were there, they would basically throw a few Roman coins around, and that's kind of what they were suggesting, I think.
So you get the idea, and then when Richard Hall asked about state control, Adrian talked about the BBC only interviewing in a car park, which might have taken to heart, and then a BBC agenda and even indoctrination. And then Adrian Gilbert implied that he expected his book, The Holy Kingdom, that is, to have become a standard work on the subject, and was a bit disgruntled by it being killed off, as he put it, by print runs supposedly being shut down, despite initially selling well, and the publisher having invested a lot of money in the book. And they talk about the possibility of the publisher being put under pressure. And then Adrian Gilbert talked about building on Wilson Blackett's 20 years of research and described his own role, saying, I've been through the research with a fine tooth comb, and I tidy things up, and I check things, and I was very meticulous in putting it all together and presenting it in a form which is digestible. Because, when you write a book, it's got to be entertaining and digestible as well as informative. So that was really what I was there to do, but it's basically their research, meaning Wilson and Blackett's research. And then the last thing I mentioned from that interview then was Adrian Gilbert connected Southeast Welsh Christianity with a sort of truer form of Christianity, not hierarchical, and uncovering the true Arthur is dangerous and exposes and threatens the established church and its hierarchy, at that time under Her Late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. Apparently, the Normans had earlier tried to control this too, particularly in Coiti. So that all sounds familiar. That's a fair summary, is it?
I think so. I mean, when Adrian went to be interviewed by the BBC, I'm not sure when it was, probably in the late 90s. If I'd have travelled all the way from Kent to Wales to only be told told to go into a car park, where he was then told that we don't have any cameras, sorry, blah blah blah, I'd probably have the ump as well.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah. I'm not even saying that these claims are right or wrong. What I want to do really is to maybe look at why some of the ideas in the books were challenged.
In the Holy Kingdom?
So we can look at Wilson Blackett's earlier stuff first, because Adrian Gilbert built on that, didn't he?
Yeah.
And he described himself as checking it meticulously. Okay, so there's a sense of an academic establishment that resisted new ideas, and the books hadn't achieved what they could have achieved. And, well, he went further, of course. So let's now have a look at maybe some of the challenges to the work. Okay, so one weakness which becomes evident when you read or listen to Wilson or maybe Adrian Gilbert is a lack of awareness of modern scholarship and a lack of reference to modern editions of their source material, editions that can be a lot more accurate than what they relied on. So I'll focus on Wilson and Blackett for the time being. We'll go through it chronologically. So I mentioned last time some criticisms by the Arthurian scholar Scott Lloyd, who picked up on Wilson and Blackett relying on erroneous transcriptions in the Liber Landavensis, which rendered the spelling of Athrois as Arthois, making it more similar to Arthur and therefore more supportive of the theory. Does that make sense?
It does, but how much emphasis should we place on the spelling of words all the way back then? Because it wasn't that important, I don't think.
Yeah, but I suppose the name was, in that source, was consistently spelt the same way, Athrois.
Okay.
And obviously, yeah, to an extent, that one letter, maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But it is important to be accurate at the same time. Now, I picked up a few things myself in that interview, selective comments on the triads, for instance, and their idea of the location of Arthur's Battle of Badon was located in a prose tale called Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, The Dream of Rhonabwy. Just doesn't fit that location. And they focus on only some of the information given in that source in locating the battle, while ignoring other clear evidence that didn't fit the theory. And it's a claim that also seems to be repeated in the Holy Kingdom. I don't think it's covered quite right there either. Is that okay? You understand that? Yeah, okay. And criticisms of this sort of methodology goes back to the earliest days that Wilson and Blackett were writing. I've got an extract here from a 1986 review of Artorius Rex discovered by the Welsh Book Council, which does make for some sobering reading for fans of the book, unfortunately. The reviewer, by the way, was D. Tecwyn Lloyd, a well-regarded lecturer in Welsh and a literary critic, so they were never completely ignored by academia. Anyway, so the review starts by comparing them to Iolo Morgannwg. Not meant to be a compliment, considering that he's usually considered to be a forger or a romantic, if you want to put it more mildly. D. Tecwyn Lloyd then commented on Wilson and Blackett's methodology, alluding to its speculative nature, as you've already commented that yourself, and the lack of real evidence. So I'll just quote it at length now once. Let me have a sip of this. So he said that hypothesis or theories offered, which a few pages or years later on becomes or is insinuated as a proven factual basis for further deductions. For instance, in the present work, we are told early on that King Arthur's HQ was a certain place called Lodge Hill, near Caerleon. But apart from a lot of a priori geographical argument, we are given no contemporary or even later documentary proof of this at all. Camelot apparently lies between Cardiff and Newport, and the derivation of its name given here, page 38, as Ca from Caer and Melot from Melin to give Caer Melin, the Yellow Fort, must surely deserve a most honourable mention in the next number of the Bulletin of Eremot Studies. I don't know what that means, by the way, but I don't think it's good. So too, the translation offered on page 162 of the Funeral Ode to Ithir Ben Dragon. Marvellous! Exclamation mark. The authors do not appear to have consulted the works of any recent Welsh or American and continental scholars in the field, and a list of manuscripts and books makes no reference to R.S. Loomis, Rachel Bromwich, A.O.H. Jarman, Kenneth Jackson, Ivor Williams, Idris Foster, or any of a dozen or more others one could cite. No doubt the authors would class them all as upstart Gwyneddites, but even a cursory acquaintance with their works would not have come amiss and would have kept the authors from at least a few gaffes. And he lists a few. All this is amusing and enjoyable enough, and the many photographs included in the text show us some interest in landscapes, even if they do not show us King Arthur. As a contribution to Arthurian scholarship, however, its value can be reckoned only in Pickwickian sense, I much fear. So that's in the Welsh Book Council journal or magazine. The comments probably ring a few bells as well, as kind of similar to what Scott Lloyd said. But it does make you wonder why this seemed to be this expectation that they would be in the academic conversation when they seem to have ignored the conversation themselves. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, so you're suggesting that Wilson and Blackett, Wilson and Blackett were didn't have anything nice to say at all about the academics in Welsh. We've established that now. But are you suggesting that they never tried to engage themselves with the academics?
They used just old versions. They didn't really, obviously the subject had moved on, but they hadn't caught up with it. Okay. So their stuff became less relevant, unfortunately.
Right.
Now, in 1986, there was a brilliant Arthurian magazine on the scene that had contributions mostly from enthusiasts. It was edited by a certain Charles Evans Gunther, who I had the honour of interviewing recently. I think you've had a few interactions with Charles too.
Oh, I have, yeah. Yeah.
Dragon magazine is all online to see now for free. Webpage is amateurarthurian.com. And thanks.
Sorry, Richard. Do check it out, because I've got a few copies now on my computer, and they're very good. They're very, very interesting.
Very, very good. Yeah,
highly recommended.
Some good illustrations in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Scott Lloyd, the Arthurian scholar, put those online. A really high standard publication, and it contains a lot of stuff relating to Wilson and Blackett. This is probably the time in which they were most active. It's not all negative either. In issue 1.7, Chris Barber wrote an article in support of their ideas. So Barber himself was an author that wrote books with many similar ideas, and I think they also collaborated. And he explains how Wilson and Blackett met, etc. And then in volume 1.10, Roger Taylor wrote something a bit more challenging the view again that Caer Melin was Camelot, saying supposedly there's no evidence for occupation at the time, and even suggested that maybe he didn't even have the name. And then volume 2.5, Charles himself wrote an article, Athroy, son of Meirig, and some other Welshmen, and critiques the theory in some detail, pointing out how the names of Arthur and Athroy aren't the same. Criticised the use of Iolo Morgannwg as a source, not considered reliable, and then focused on some of their translations in Marwnadith Ben again. It's difficult to see how they came up with many of their translations, to be honest. But I will say poetry can be a bit obscure, generally a bit of a minefield. So they needed to put some further notes in, really, to make it clear. And they also said the poem hadn't been translated, which was wrong as well. It had been translated. And I notice in the Holy Kingdom as well, there are some curious translations there too, where I could do with a bit more explanation how they got them. For instance, I don't see how Ffordd y Gyfraith works out as Road of the Tumult, but I mean, I could stand corrected. If anyone knows, let me know. On the other hand, I don't particularly like the translation Charles used in that article. There's probably a better one now in this Margaret Haycock's edition of the works of Taliesin. Try and get your hands on a copy of that. the point I'm trying to make is it's not just the academics that were taking a skeptical view of Wilson and Blackett. It was amateur enthusiasts too, but people that really knew the subject and the sources for just the fun of it. And it's difficult to see how they would have had a vested interest in maintaining any academic status quo, for instance.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, it should be said that Wilson and Blackett did develop quite a large following themselves, didn't they?
Yeah, they've still got a following. Yeah, I know people who used to follow them back in the day, and they've been very helpful with my research as well. So, yeah, agree with that. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. Maybe they are right, if you know what I mean. But there are criticisms you can make as well. There's always criticisms you can make of everyone, but I don't think it was clear enough in the interview between Richard Hall and Adrian Gilbert. Okay, on to the Holy Kingdom itself now. Now, there's quite a supportive review by the late Brian Davis, former curator of Pontypridd Museum, in an English language literary magazine called the New Welsh Review. So Brian Davis was a knowledgeable historian, but I don't think that you'd really call him an academic as such, but a knowledgeable man. So let's have a butchers of that now. So Brian Davis starts a review by saying that a Welsh candidate for historical author isn't in fashion, despite the vast amounts of evidence, in his opinion. I think he's supportive of the theory generally, to be honest, reading between the lines. And then he says, I'm going to quote at length now. Gilbert, who made a name with the Orion mystery, has reworked and built upon the investigations of Alan Wilson and Tony Blackett. Their previous efforts, published by themselves, have achieved minor cult status, kind of what you said. Ignored by academics, they have been shamelessly plagiarized by populists such as Chris Barber and Lawrence Main. This is the first time that their work has found a major publisher. It's an unforgettable read. It's like picking up a volume by one of those wonderful 18th or 19th century antiquarians who were capable of careful investigation and meticulous research, yet could still be carried away by wildly optimistic speculation, and were not beyond occasionally bending the evidence to fit a theory which they felt must be true. It's not difficult to spot howlers, wrong dates, highly idiosyncratic, and to me, unsustainable readings of monumental inscriptions and quixotic translations. Yet there is potentially a healthy baby here which deserves not to be thrown out with this murky bathwater. Oh, sorry, there's more. This is not just another book on Arthur, but an attempt to validate much, though by no means all, of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written in 1136. Key elements of the argument are not new, only forgotten. Evan Evans, Ian Brydydd Hir, and others in the 18th and early 19th centuries thought that the Chronicle of Tysillion might be the source upon which Geoffrey had based his history. The current trend is to dismiss this possibility, so that the existence of this chronicle is hardly known, and Geoffrey's work is conventionally dismissed as fiction. However, a Canadian scholar, Hugh A. MacDougall, made it clear nearly 20 years ago that the rejection of Geoffrey's history was prompted less by an historical critique than by the changing demands of English political culture. See his Racial Myth in English History, 1982. Now, Gilbert has made good enough use of Tysillion for this long-forgotten text to require very careful re-examination. The strongest of Gilbert's arguments concerns the nature of Roman rule in Britain. The exceptional richness of the material now on show in the British Museum's new gallery on Roman Britain must finally dispel the notion that this was a poor colony on the periphery of the Roman world and that its native people were simple primitives. Few will follow all of Gilbert's arguments here, but he does ask essential questions about the role of Britain and the British within the empire, and brings us back to intriguing evidence which has received little attention. For Arthurian enthusiasts, this book may be something of a disappointment. Yet the author's explanation of the development of the story of Arthur is quite plausible. Again, they elaborating upon an idea first put forward long ago, this time by Edward Llwyd. The subject matter of the Holy Kingdom is vast. It concerns matters of interest to many well outside of the circle of dedicated Arthurians. Some of its propositions are preposterous. Others are highly plausible. Many can only be tested by further research and, as Gilbert rightly points out, by archaeological investigation. To have written such a complex and contradictory book is a highly unusual achievement. It is both it will both infuriate and inspire. Okay, so a lot to unpack there. Did you want to ask anything before I go on?
Yeah, go
on. So you mentioned another one of your old Chinas, Lawrence Main.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what he was alluding to there, because I don't consider Lawrence Main or Chris Barber to have plagiarized Wilson and Blackett.
No, I think, as I understand it, Richard, Lawrence was talking about this Arthur in Gwent and Glamorgan before Wilson and Blackett published anything on the subject. And I happen to know that when Wilson and Blackett first published Arturius Rex Discovered, Lawrence Main wrote them a letter congratulating them for their work and research. And Lawrence got a letter back saying words to the effect of, don't you dare plagiarize us. You know, we're not interested in you, blah, 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 blah. So in other words, he got a very unpleasant reply in response.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't consider him to be a plagiarist or Barber either. So I don't support that. But a lot of the things I do support in that review. But I suppose this is a review that is about as positive as you can get about the book, while still be semi-grounded in reality. You know, but let's be honest, he did also suggest there are big issues with the book, using words like wildly optimistic speculation, occasionally bending the evidence to fit a theory, howlers, misreadings, wrong dates, and on the whole, then difficult to reconcile these comments with Adrian's comments that everything had been checked with a fine-tooth comb.
Well, can I just make a point about the dating? Because this was something I was going to ask you about, believe it or not. So, as I understand it, and I'm quite new to this, but as I understand it, in Arturius Rex Discovered, Wilson and Blackett pointed out that some of the dates are contested, in that I think it's the Roman Catholic Church that base their dates on the incarnation of Jesus Christ, whereas the Welsh Church or the early British Church based the dates on the crucifixion of Jesus. So, in other words, everything is 33 years out. So,
yeah, it's an interesting idea. I don't think we've got definitive proof of it, but yeah, it's an interesting idea, and that's the sort of speculation I don't mind at all. That's actually a decent suggestion. You'd have to take it. You don't have to accept it, of course, but that's not bad at all. Yeah, so on the positive, Brian praised Adrian Gilbert's comments on the Chronicle of Tassilia, aka Brutus Cilia. He said it was long forgotten by academia or something like that. You probably know where I'm going with this now, because I don't agree with that. And I did a video recently, didn't I, on Brutus Cilia? And I've actually found quite a bit written by it. And even after the book is still been written about as well. So I've made a start and putting some on YouTube, starting with the idea of where the name came from. And they seem, around the year 1600, there seems to have been this belief that Tassilia had written the chronicle, but I think most of the evidence points to that as being an ecclesiastical chronicle, so concerned with the church. But it's now lost, of course. And there was also a version of the Brut that had been ascribed to Tassiliar, but in a late hand written in English. So I think it's probably been a misunderstanding there, and think what Tassiliar, what earlier been ascribed to Tassiliar, was probably something a bit different to the Brute, if you know what I mean. So a bit of a misunderstanding, but that's not for definite, of course.
Okay.
It was a popular idea that Tassiliar had written a Brute from the early 18th century, and it was Geoffrey's source book in the British tongue. So essentially, it strengthened the idea of the Trojan founding of Britain, King Arthur, etc., because it wasn't total fantasy. So they argued. And I think Adrian suggested that Brute Tassiliar was the source of the HRB in the Holy Kingdom as well. And as I say, it's not popular with academics today, and unfortunately, you don't get a sense of why this is by reading the Holy Kingdom. And it goes back to really not considering modern scholarship. If they'd done so, they could have addressed it in the book. Scholars today really have convincingly showed, in my opinion, that Brute Tassiliar is just a late version of Brut de Brenhinedd. So that's a Welsh copy of Geoffrey's Latin text, essentially, as traces of quite recent Welsh in it. And
sorry, Richard. Where did Geoffrey get his information from? What book was he copying from?
Well, that's the question. How seriously do you take his claim that he even had any source material? So he probably used his Story Bretonum, Gildas, or similar sources to that. Maybe use some genealogies, or maybe the claim is true. I haven't got an opinion on it, to be honest. And opinions vary from people thinking that there was a genuine source book to people thinking that it's largely fiction.
Okay.
I just think we don't know for sure, do we?
It would appear not, I suppose. I mean, I was under the impression that most of what Geoffrey wrote was accurate, but he was adding some, flowery language and throwing in a few mermaids and, mythical creatures to try and sell some books.
That's
and
right. Yeah.
That explanation kind of stands up to me.
Yeah, maybe it was like that. Yeah. But in terms of Brute Tassiliar being the source, it shows misunderstandings of Latin as well. So, you would have thought it was the other way around. But, I'll go into it in more detail in another video.
Okay.
So by missing out the modern scholarship, it doesn't really give the reader a balanced view on the topic. And this misconception that Brute Tassiliar isn't understood by modern scholars, or has been forgotten, is then just repeated. And once again, I think it's quite ironic that there's this sense that they've been ignored by academics, when I think it may have been the other way around, actually.
Okay, that's interesting.
Now, okay, so just to reiterate again, I like the books, and I started with these sort of books, and I've got a lot out of them. But some of the comments in the interview, at least, I think, are worth putting in context. So that's what I hope I've achieved with this. Now then, did you want to take any questions at this point?
I was going to say, I will ask you one more question before I do that, I think. So, do you think it's true, because we just finished there talking about academics, do you think it's true that English academics have ignored the historical Welsh sources when it comes to Dark Age Britain, King Arthur, etc.? Do you think that's a valid accusation?
So, in terms of Welsh language sources, I mean, it means drawing on Welsh poetry, and that's an absolute minefield. Should it even be taken as historical source at all? I mean, a lot of the poetry seems to be set at that time, but is that when it was written? And, you know, the academic opinion ranges from them being composed quite late to them being composed at a more contemporary time. So there's just such a range of opinion on everything that it's difficult to speak of academics as a sort of unified, homogenous group, because you buy a certain edition has completely different ideas in it to others, and then there's a lot of articles as well that challenge certain views too. So it's difficult to answer, to be honest.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah, go on. Is there anything else? Anything in the chat box?
It's extensive, mate. There's so many comments going on. I haven't noticed any questions in capitals yet. So if anyone is asking for, Richard questions, can you please put them in capitals? Because otherwise you're just going to be looking at me staring at the chat box, trying to work out who's saying what. I think I made the mistake early on of before Richard came on of mentioning the digital ID, because that's there's been a few comments about that, and perhaps I shouldn't have done that, because that's not what we're here for. But blimey, that's been going on this week, hasn't it? Just a bit.
Yeah, I won't give an opinion.
No, neither will I. All right, questions in capitals, please. So I will put on. I'm not even halfway through the comments yet, Richard, so bear with me. Mona has said, with Alan's work, it's relatively easy to decipher what went wrong. He also provides evidence and names to support his claims. And Dialerod has said, speculation in certain fields of research are, I think, necessary. However, in such a scenario as history, and emotive history at that, if the speculation cannot be backed, ?
Yeah, I don't mind speculation as long as proper context is provided.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It has to be presented as speculation. No, this is what we think might be the case. It's pure speculation, etc. What is this? Adam Groves has said, it needs to be looked at through a realistic lens. You can see evidence of over romanticizing in today's world, so it could happen in history.
What a brilliant comment.
Yeah, that's more than fair enough, I would say. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Biker Bill Dogs, what makes Britain great? What a superb name that is. Right, okay, so Arthur is clearly Arthur. So Arthur spelled Athrwys, he's clearly Arthur. What on earth does variations of spellings from upset academics who don't bother to study mean?
Was that a quote or something? Was that something I read out?
No, I think it's just an opinion.
Oh, okay.
So she's talking about the Arthur that's spelt with WYS on the end.
Athroyd.
Arthroyd, yeah, clearly being Arthur.
They're not the same name, though, are they? So
people are saying that you clearly don't like Wilson and Blackett. I don't think
that's not true.
That's not what Richard has said. I don't think that's
out of their work.
Yeah,
but certain challenges have to be made as well.
And there's some disagreements going on in the chat box about how reliable academia is, whether or not it's a closed shop, which I think is it's a broad conversation that's been going on, not just with history, but with science in recent years and all sorts of other things like Egyptology, for example. There's another one where alternative, for want of a better word, researchers have put forward some very interesting and I think credible ideas about Egypt and the pyramids, etc. And they're not entertained by academia. But then when we're talking about Egyptology, sorry to digress slightly, but when we're talking about Egyptology, the official explanation for things like the pyramids do seem to be the least credible, certainly in my opinion anyway. So I think there's a general distrust of academia in general at the moment. There's a lot of emphasis on experts all the time, the government experts. And I think people have lost faith to a certain extent. Some people have lost faith with academia in this country. This looks like a question in capitals. In Victor Alton's book, published by Kimroglyphics, he suggests that St. Patrick was based on 3 people. Could this be true of King Arthur as well? Thank you, Daniela Holland, for that question.
Not sure about St. Patrick. In terms of Arthur, I probably see one Arthur. But it could be a composite as well. We just don't really get a clear enough picture from the early sources. But I suppose I probably see one Arthur.
Okay. Which I suppose is the right approach to all this. But having said that, I've heard that there's a King Arthur of Scotland. There's an Arthur in Cornwall, and you've made a video on the Cornish Arthur. So there does seem to be more than one within British history.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to talk about them in the next part now. So I don't know when you want me to move on. Is there any more questions?
Let me just double check very quickly. There's nothing. So do please remember to put your sorry, I've just found one there, and I wanted to put on a comment, and then I'll put on a question, and then we'll go back to you, Richard. The comment comes from Marshall Abrahams, who said there's a colophon to Bruticilio which shows Geoffrey was commissioned to translate the Old Welsh book.
Yeah,
I must confess, I don't know what a colophon is. Do you, Richard?
Yes. So the colophon sort of describes the origin of the brute. So it kind of, there's this idea that Geoffrey translated something from a very old book in the British tongue. Variations of that claim appear across the texts, really. And in the later Welsh versions, it's a claim that seems to have developed and even been misunderstood. So what you get published in the Myvyrian Archaeology, I think, was the idea that Walter translated it from Welsh into Latin and then back from Latin into Welsh.
Okay.
That's the colophon there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. Hugh Evans, question. Did Richard know King Charles III visited the battlefield at Dinas Mawdi?
No, I didn't. Is that recently? I didn't.
Yeah, it must have been, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's one possibility of where the Battle of Camlan was, near Dinas Mawdi. It still has that name to this day.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Saint Tadechor, that's in Mallwyd as well, so near to the battle site. That's where Lawrence, I believe, placed it. I think it's the most likely candidate somewhere in that area as well. So yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, me too. Daniela Holland, was all the Welsh poetry written by the bards?
Big question. So with Taliesin, a lot of it seems to have been reworked by a later bard called Prydydd y Moch, Llywarch ap Llywelyn, who was in the 12th or 13th century, something like that. So Margaret Haycock in her edition shows that. But also then there are some that are believed to be contemporary with historical Taliesin. So some could be, some are ruled out for linguistic reasons. And then when it comes to the Gododdin, obviously that's attributed to Aneirin, and Aneirin was said to be living around the year 600, according to the Historia Brittonum. And opinions vary as to whether that poem originates from that time. Some people, some credible arguments say that they are, and then others put it much later. So it's contested.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'll just put this comment on. John Hawke has said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Unfortunately, that is lacking in many instances in some of these works discussed. That's a fair point. And I think that's, you would share that opinion, Richard.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let's finish up with the comments for now. So you're going to talk us through positive approaches to Arthurian history.
Yeah. So if we just draw a line under that, so obviously I mentioned some challenges now to Adrian Gilbert's positive approach. A book that I do like on the whole, just to stress that. But there are others, of course, who do it in a slightly different way. And I'll look at 3 books now published within the last couple of decades that are positive, because I know you want to know about recent stuff that's been published in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose what these have in common is that they all see the essential validity and historicity of the 2 sources that I mentioned right at the start of the interview. Do you remember what they're called?
Give us a clue. Yeah, I don't know.
It's the HP and the AC. So Historia Brittonum and the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Annals. And I suppose these positive approaches think that despite there being so few sources that really corroborate Arthur, these 2 essentially have every indication of being legit. They aren't too fanciful, for instance, and the picture they paint is totally plausible and seems to fit the period. And maybe scholarship on the whole is too harsh in dismissing them or not being more positive about them. So, first one, I mentioned this a few times on my show, Lost Legend of Arthur by Lloyd and Blake.
Mentioned Scott Lloyd.
Yeah, Scott Lloyd, yeah. Good author. Obviously, he's moved on to other stuff after this as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good author, really good author. And I mentioned it in my interview with Charles Evans Gunther, if you remember. He didn't seem to be as much of a fan. But I like this book, and it's positive about the historical Arthur, and it ties in particularly down to the territory of North Wales. Now, you probably realise that the earliest sources originate from Wales, so perhaps it's easiest in a way to think of Arthur as actually coming from that territory, although the territory of Wales wasn't formed, as we know it now. The analysis of the source is always fair and plausible. There are occasional selective readings, but it's generally a pretty high standard for this genre. And it's less guilty of those sorts of things than most. And one thing I liked about it is that it tries to reconstruct the earliest Welsh tradition on Arthur in quite a speculative way, but it doesn't twist the evidence either. The book looks at all sorts of connections across literature, and in presenting sources, it's really reliable. One interesting chapter is called The Genealogy of Arthur, which makes an interesting suggestion on how one aspect of the story may have developed, possibly from a misunderstanding, which I think that you will be interested in. I did say I was going to stay away from poetry, but I'll sneak this in. Is in the Black Book of Carmarthen, there's a poem called Me of Him, I Have Been, which is really obscure in all sorts of ways that I don't want to get into the time remaining. Even the basic stuff is not really known, such as who is the speaker, what are the themes, for example. But he uses the word Ithir in relation to Arthur. So Arthur is the proper pronunciation of Arthur. I usually use Arthur just for simplicity. Anyway, so I thought it'd be interesting to bring this up because obviously Ithir was in Geoffrey of Monmouth the name of Arthur's shape-shifting father who impregnated Arthur's mother in some very questionable circumstances. So I'll give you a few lines of the poem. Mm-hmm. This is Mi a fim lle llachai, mab Arthur, Ithir yng Ngherddau, ban Raint Brain ar Crai, which means I have been where Llachai was slain, son of Arthur, terrible in songs, where when ravens rushed to go or croaked on go. So the word Ithyr in this early poem is just the word terrible. But these authors question whether this poem or something like it was mistakenly used as a source by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So this obviously isn't for definite, of course, but essentially what these authors ask is, did Geoffrey come across this line or a line very similar to it and read it incorrectly as Arthur mab Ithyr yng Ngherddau, which would then translate as Arthur the son of Ithyr in songs. Okay, so it's speculative, but it's presented in the right way, and this is the sort of way that it should be done.
Okay.
And, you know, they don't mind speculating in the book, but they never stretch anything too far. There's some other poetic references to Ithyr in Welsh poetry too, which I'll go into more next time. But Lloyd and Blake conclude that the lack of mention of Ithyr by the Gogyn Feirdd, that's the not so early bards, poets of the Welsh princes, might indicate that Ithyr wasn't an important figure. Yeah, so I put that in because you asked me in the last interview about Uther Pendragon. Yeah, but it's difficult to know exactly who or what he was. Obviously, there's loads more in the book, but it's always reasonable in the way they present the respective suggestions, and you know, it's an informative book on the whole. And a lot of it's presented as a gazetteer as well, listing the people and the places, etc. So it's structured in a way that's easy to search and use as a reference guide. That's something really important to do. Okay, on Camlan, this is a book that stresses that Arthur died at Camlan. You remember me saying in the past that the Welsh tradition is particularly clear on this. And this awareness of the scholarly landscape means it's a good addition and provides good commentary on the sources. So I'll just mention one more thing about it. It uses quite an obscure source called The True History of the Death of Arthur, which mentions the death of Arthur in a certain landscape, and then from that they draw out where they believe his grave was as well. And it's one of the better suggestions that I've viewed. And then it suggests that Arthur was probably not a king himself. They look at the early sources and point to him being something similar to a pentale. That's a formal role in the Welsh medieval king's court. Probably the most important role, head of the king's guard. So they asked whether the king in question was Maelgwn Gwynedd, Gildas' Maglacunas, and then Arthur could have been the commander of his forces, explaining why he was mentioned by Gildas, for instance, who was addressing kings. All right, is that clear?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Nennius said that I believe he wrote that Arthur wasn't king yet when he fought those 12 battles. So wouldn't that indicate that he was going to be king, or he ended up being a king at some point?
I mean, I think the different variations, the different recensions phrase it in a slightly different way. The one I look at just says he led the kings of the Britain. So his role is quite ambiguous, let's say that. It doesn't preclude him from being the king. I would agree with that, at least.
So he was like a Pendragon, a military leader.
Yeah, so yeah, Pendragon in Welsh does mean a sort of commander-in-chief, something like that. So yeah, you could say that.
Brilliant.
Okay, next one I'll mention, Reign of Arthur. I mentioned in our last interview, and that's published in 2004, written by Christopher Gidlow. And this is so clear and well argued that anyone could read it and enjoy it, even if you've not read anything on Arthur before. And it's an ideal place to start. Chris Gidlow is always faithful to the sources. No wild speculations, no implausible interpretations, no twisting anything. And he says that even though some of the sources that mention Arthur may only originate centuries after his time, this doesn't necessarily make them untrustworthy. And reliability perhaps is better judged by looking at things like internal consistency and the overall plausibility of the account. So that's something interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I like his analysis of the Historia Britonum, which describes the earlier Saxon settlement of Britain under Hengist and Horsa on the Saxon side. The settlement that was enabled by the British leader Vortigern.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Britons took up the fight, and there was 3 successive resistance leaders around that time that really took up the fight. Vortimer, the son of Vortigern, Arthur, and then Autegern. And the way that the 3 resistant leaders are talked about by the author of the Historia Britonum, Nennius, if you like, is similar. And no one doubts that the other 2 were real historical figures. The implication being that we should also treat Arthur in the same way. He was probably historical as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that Gidlow also sees the essential truth in Gildas's description of the carnage in Britain after the Romans left. Obviously, not all the natives are massacred. We are told that the remnant lived as honest slaves. And that kind of follows a pattern followed elsewhere in the Roman Empire. Germanic settlers coming in return for military service. They then fully take over the lands. But I suppose what's different about Britain is that they organise their own defence against this. And it's something that's corroborated by the 5th century Byzantine historian Zosimus, who said the Britons, fighting for themselves, freed their cities from the attacking barbarians. So this would be slightly before Arthur's time, but shows the sort of world that he became part of. Another interesting point is comparison between Ambrosius Aurelianus and Arthur. Ambrosius was said by Gildas to have taken the fight against the Saxons, so there's definitely a historical root to him. There's also a great deal of legend attached to him in the prophecies of Vortigern, for instance. On the other hand, material attached to Arthur in the Historia Britonum is more plausible. So you've got Ambrosius Aurelianus, who is considered historical, but is also given legendary material, and then Arthur, who doesn't have the legendary stuff, but some might not consider him to be historical. So it gives you something to think about, at least. And he also speculated the origin of the sources too, and concluded that the author must have blended various sources to come up with the Arthurian battle list, 12 battles. Meaning knowledge of Arthur was widespread at an early date, essentially corroborating the historicity. All right, there's loads more I could say, but I'm going over, so let's talk about one more.
Okay, I was going to say save it for another episode, but we'll have one more. Go on.
Try to squeeze one more in. Okay.
Go on, why not?
Hot off the press, only published this year. King Arthur and the Languages of Britain by Bernard Mees. The author is an academic specializing in linguistics and crucially sees the language of the source material as indicating that the accounts of Arthur are authentic.
Wow.
He believes that the language of the Historia Britonum and the Annales Cambriae represents material that was accurately copied from Arthur's own time. There would be no reason to doubt Arthur's historicity, of course, if this was the case. Now, Mees seems to see Arthur based in the north. And it may be logical that this was the case, since the Saxons were invited to Britain in the first place to defend from attacks from the north. So maybe they were posted to Hadrian's Wall. It's a traditional defense from the north, wasn't it? And then you could maybe see a situation where the Saxons rebelled, as we're told. So they would logically be a front of the war up north. So maybe Arthur fought them there. I think I haven't had time to fully digest this book. I've only recently got it, but it also seems to be evidence that Germanic tribes were posted in Newcastle area in the late Roman period. The leader of forces at Hadrian's Wall in the late Roman period also had the title Dux Britanniarum, strikingly similar to Arthur's description as Dux Bellorum in the Historia Britonum. Maybe he was evoking this earlier Roman era position in some way. So maybe there was even a continuity between the old Roman regime and the early Welsh kingdoms. Interestingly as well, the Castlestead fort on Hadrian's Wall is known to have been called Cambo Glanna, a name that regularly would have developed into Camlan. And the battle of this name was associated with Arthur, where he and Medrawd fell, according to the Annales Cambriae. Just a little bit more to say. So the Annales Cambriae is believed to have been begun by monks in St. David's in the late 8th century. But earlier entries added retrospectively something of questionable historicity. So that includes the Arthurian entries, of course. The earliest copy of the text dates the 11th century. One interesting thing to point out is the form of the names. It's Arthur, spelled how we do today, but the name is believed to have developed from the Latin Artorius. So maybe not the form of the name that you would expect if those entries actually came from that time, and if Arthur actually developed from the name Artorius. So that raises some questions. I think the author argues that the names were updated by later copyists, but for me, it may be questionable that the name Arthur even developed from Artorius. I haven't got a definitive answer on that, but that's a question that raises for me. And then the author argues there's physical evidence to support the entries too. Both the HB and the AC have this idea of Arthur carrying a cross on his shoulders. And the origin of this may be a style of brooch worn at the time, kind of cross shape that was sometimes even engraved with the cross. And the other thing that may corroborate it is the second Arthurian entry, when Camlan happened, supposedly in 537, mentioned the mortality in Britain and Ireland. It is now widely believed to have been a famine at that time, and this entry seems to refer to that, or possibly does anyway. That's corroborating the account. I think it was the Greek historian Procopius that mentioned some sort of climatic event that's believed to have caused this. And so a lot more in it as well. It's heavy in places, but heavy in a good way.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So I'll leave it there.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you, Richard, for that. Really enjoyed it. The chat in the chat box has been off the charts this evening. I think it's remained civil throughout, which is a good thing. So thank you, everyone, for all your comments. I've got a question here from somebody called Philip A. Demick. That's a new name. Welcome, Philip. What is the likelihood of Arthur having the surname Pengern? Pengern.
I don't know, to be honest. Sorry, Philip.
Yeah, fair enough. If you could follow up, Philip, where do you get the name Pengern from? Where's that come from? Perhaps you could elaborate on that for us, please. Okay, I think that's just about it as far as questions from the floor are concerned. I've got one or two questions for you, Richard.
Yeah, go for it. I'm not in a rush.
You made a video about a month ago, I think, or slightly more recently than that, and you took some great footage. You visited Caerleon, which, if I remember rightly, was where Merlin's boy got thrown out of last week. Anyway, we won't go there. So, do do the Welsh triads, poems and folklore that we've discussed this evening, and the Mabinogi all point to Caerleon being Arthur's Camelot?
Well, I suppose Camelot comes from later romances, doesn't it? So I don't know if that name originates from within Wales. Obviously, one of the better known triads is the Tair Lleithig Lwyth Ynys Prydain, 3 tribal thrones of the island of Britain. And I think the earliest versions set that at Cechuig in Hednew, so Cechuig in Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
Manu, which is present-day St David's in west of Wales, and then Penrhionedd in the Gogledd, so that means Penrhionedd in the north, an unknown location, and Cechuig's unknown as well. So Manu is the only clear one there. But I think later versions may have changed some of the details to Caerleon, but that's believed to have been under the influence of Geoffrey of Monmouth. So in terms of Caerleon, I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth set Arthur's magnificent plenary court there before he went on European campaign. Where did Geoffrey get the idea from? Well, he was potentially from that area because it's not far from Monmouth. So maybe he knew something. And then in folklore, the Roman amphitheatre at Caerleon had the name of Arthur's Round Table. Is that something that came later? We haven't got early evidence for it, I suppose. But I mean, it was a legionary fortress. There's a hill fort there, and we know that the Britons reoccupied hill forts.
I think there's several, so I understand it, several hill forts in that kind of area.
Yeah, there's loads of hill forts in this area.
And are they dated to 6th century?
So I think they had quite a long period of occupation. So, you know, activity from, in some cases, late Bronze Age maybe, and then the Iron Age. There's more evidence again. Not so much for the Roman times, I don't think. And then after the Roman occupation finished, I think certain ones were reoccupied. A lot of the Arthurian stuff was focused on Cadbury Castle, wasn't it, in the West Country?
Yeah.
That hit the headlines. That was a really big site, and they proved sort of conclusively that it was occupied at the right time for Arthur. Mm-hmm. And there's some Arthurian folklore in that area too. So, yeah.
Very nice. Okay, brilliant. Well, I've just noticed another question from the audience. Biker Bill Dogs. What does Richard actually conclude and stand by?
Yeah, I think that Arthur was a historical person that led the Britons against the Saxons, pretty much as the story of Britannum concludes. I think he was the leader at the Battle of Baden, which seems to have been a real turning point in the war as well, and believed to have been the greatest warrior of his day, perhaps, judging by the Welsh poetry. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have been a king in the sort of medieval sense that they were kings. Actually, the best known stories of Arthur come from the late medieval period, or the chivalry and that sort of thing. So that's a bit anachronistic to apply that to Arthur. But I think we can say he was the greatest British warrior of his day, believed to have turned the tide against the Saxons.
Mm-hmm. Great stuff. Brilliant. Okay. I think we should save anything else for later now for another episode. But I've really enjoyed your presentation, Richard, and I really enjoy your approach to this history, which, as I've said, I think is very pragmatic and sensible. So I hope we can do it again. Thank you to everyone that's watched and contributed so much this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic. Please like the video. Before I forget, I always forget to do this. Please like the video. and do subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. And I will see you next week for episode, I think it's 38 of the CV, when Adrian Gilbert will be my guest. There we go. So we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, Richard. Cheers.
Cheers.